Chapter 1. The Night the Keys Stopped Turning. The bronze keys had always turned for 1,924 years, since the day Constantine's Masons first set them into the hands of Pope Sylvester. The keys of St. Peter had opened every lock they were asked to open. They had opened the ancient doors of the Constantinian Basilica, the gates of the medieval city, the iron grills of the Renaissance Confessio, the titanium safes of the modern archives. They had never hesitated, not once, until the evening of October 6th, 2024. Brother Matteo, the San Pietrino who had carried them for 43 years, felt the resistance first. He was locking the Baldacchino gates at the close of Sunday Vespers when the teeth simply stopped. No grinding, no scrape of metal on metal, just refusal, as if the lock had turned to stone. Matteo tried the second key, the third, the fourth. His old fingers trembled. The keys were warm, almost feverish, and when he pressed them to his lips in apology, an old Roman habit, he tasted blood, not his own. By nightfall, the news had reached the apostolic palace like a cold wind under the doors. Cardinals whispered in corridors that had not known panic since the sack of 1527. The Swiss Guard doubled the patrols. The prefect of the papal household canceled all audiences. And at 22:17 Rome time, a single encrypted message left the Domus Sanctae Marthae for a small apartment in Washington. D.C., come at once, bring nothing holy, the keys have remembered something. Father Luca Rossi was on the overnight flight from Dulles before he had even finished reading it. He was 37, tall, sunburnt from years in the Iraqi desert, where he had served as a Marine chaplain before the nightmares drove him to the seminary. Rome had made him an exorcist because he was one of the few priests alive who had seen worse things than demons. His eyes were the color of winter sea ice, and when he stepped off the Alitalia Red-Eye at dawn on October 7th, the Swiss Guard lieutenant who met him at Fiumicino noticed that Luca carried no luggage, only a battered leather satchel and the faint smell of cordite that never quite left his skin. They drove him straight to the Vatican through streets still empty of tourists. The city felt hollowed out, as though it were holding its breath. At the Porta Sant'Anna, he was handed a black cassock, still smelling of the sacristy's cedar closets. And within 20 minutes, he was standing alone beneath the great dome of St. Peter's, the only living soul inside the largest church on earth. It was just after 11 p.m. The basilica was not dark. It never truly is. Hundreds of votive lamps glowed like low red stars along the side chapels, and the great floodlights outside painted the marble in pale gold. But the silence was absolute. No echo of footsteps, no creak of old wood, no whisper of wind through the high windows, only the faint metallic breathing of the air conditioning far below. Luca walked the length of the central nave, past the statues of the founders, past the twisted columns of Bernini's Baldacchino, until he stood directly beneath Michelangelo's dome. He set his satchel on the floor and opened it. Inside lay the only thing he had been allowed to bring, a small iron box containing the original bronze keys of the kingdom, flown in under diplomatic seal from the treasury vault. They had been removed from their velvet reliquary and wrapped in plain linen, like a corpse prepared for burial. He knelt on the cold porphyry disk that marks the exact center of Christendom and unwrapped them. The keys were heavier than memory. The larger one, the key of power, was almost black with age. The smaller, the key of knowledge, still carried flecks of gold from the day it was forged in a Damascus smithy in the 4th century. Luca laid them side by side on the stone. Then he waited. He did not pray. He had learned in Fallujah that some silences are too old for words. The first hour passed like deep water. At 12:47 a.m., the temperature began to fall, not gradually, the way it does when the heating cycles off, sharply, as though someone had opened a door to a crypt and left it ajar. Luca's breath appeared in front of him in small white clouds. Frost bloomed across the bronze rails of the confession grate 20 meters away. He did not move. At 1:13 a.m., the votive lamps began to dim, one by one, starting from the chapel of the Pietà and moving clockwise around the basilica like a slow, dying heartbeat. By 1:30, only the 7 lamps directly above the papal altar still burned. Their flames stood perfectly upright, unmoving, as though the air itself had frozen. Then the child's voice began. It came from everywhere and nowhere, soft, genderless, patient. 266, it said. Luca's spine straightened. He knew that number. It was the exact tally of canonically recognized popes from Peter to the present day. The Vatican's own website listed it in the Annuario Pontificio. 265, the voice continued, a little closer now, as though the speaker had taken one step toward him across the marble. Luca reached for the keys. His fingers brushed the metal, and he flinched. They were burning cold. 264. The counting was slow, almost gentle, the way a mother counts heartbeats on a fevered child. Each number arrived exactly 9 seconds after the last. Luca stood. He turned in a full circle, searching the shadows beneath the piers, the galleries, the confessionals. Nothing moved. 260. He felt the first tug then, a subtle pressure behind his sternum, as though invisible fingers had hooked into his ribs and begun to pull him downward, not violently, patiently. 259. The 7 remaining lamps above the altar guttered in perfect unison, dipped low, and then flared brighter than before, white as magnesium. In that sudden glare, Luca saw them, footprints appearing on the dusty marble in front of the baldacchino, small bare feet, no larger than a 10-year-old's, walking straight toward him across stone that had not been disturbed in hours. 258. The footprints stopped exactly 1 meter from where he stood. The air above them shimmered like heat haze, and for an instant Luca thought he saw the outline of a child in a white baptismal robe, head bowed, hands clasped in prayer. Then the image was gone. He looked down at the keys. The linen cloth beneath them was now soaked dark. Fresh blood, warm and bright, seeping from the metal itself, spreading outward in a perfect circle. 257. Luca knelt again. He pressed both palms flat against the cold bronze. The blood coated his skin like oil. "Show me," he whispered in Latin, the first words he had spoken since entering the basilica. "Whatever you are, show me." The counting stopped. For one heartbeat, the silence was total. Then the keys began to move, slowly, deliberately. The larger key rotated 90 degrees clockwise. The smaller followed, turning counterclockwise until the two crossed like an X directly over the porphyry disk. There was no hand touching them. They moved as though guided by an unseen wrist. A low, grinding sound rose from beneath the floor, deep and tectonic. The sound of stone dragging across stone after centuries of stillness. Dust sifted from the joints of the marble. The porphyry disk itself, a single slab weighing several tons, lifted a finger's breadth and slid sideways with a sigh, revealing a narrow flight of steps descending into absolute black. The scent that rose from the opening was ancient beyond imagining: myrrh, candle smoke, wet earth, and something metallic that tasted of old blood on the tongue. From the darkness below came the child's voice again, soft, almost relieved. "Thank you, Father," it said. "We have been waiting such a long time for the 267th. The 7 lamps above the altar went out together in the sudden dark. Luca heard the soft, wet click of metal on metal as the keys of the kingdom lifted themselves from the blood-soaked cloth and settled gently into his right hand. The bronze was warm now, almost alive, and somewhere far below, in a place no map of the Vatican has ever shown, something wearing the ring of the fisherman began to smile. Chapter 2. The door sealed by 3 popes who never existed. The staircase had no railing. Each step was a single block of black basalt, worn into a shallow scoop by feet that had descended only once before, 925 years earlier. The air grew thicker with every breath, as though the darkness itself had weight. Luca's flashlight carved a thin tunnel of pale light, but the beam seemed reluctant to travel far, as if the dark pushed back. Behind him, Cardinal Vincente followed in silence. The old man moved with the fluid caution of someone who had spent a lifetime among things that bite. Vincente was 81, skeletal, and the head of the Archivio Apostolico Segreto for 43 years. His cassock was the color of dried blood under the torchlight, and his eyes were the pale gray of winter skies over the Tiber. He carried nothing but a small leather folio and a ring of iron keys, so ancient they looked more like archaeological relics than tools. They counted 166 steps before the passage leveled. The corridor ahead was perfectly circular, 8 feet in diameter, bored through living tufa like the throat of some colossal stone worm. The walls wept a slow, mineral sweat that smelled of iron and incense every 7 paces. A shallow niche had once held an oil lamp. The clay bowls were still there, blackened, filled now with nothing but centuries of dust. At the far end stood the door. It was not large, barely taller than a man, and no wider than a confessional. It was made of oak so old it had petrified into something closer to obsidian, bound with straps of bronze gone green. 3 wax seals, the size of saucers, hung from it, on silk cords the color of dried violets. Each seal was cracked but intact, the wax still glossy, as though the heat of a candle had left it only moments ago. Cardinal Vincente stopped 3 meters away and made the sign of the cross so slowly it looked like ritual. Luca stepped forward. The first seal was the color of arterial blood. Impressed into its center was the tiara and keys of Victor IV, antipope, of 1159-1164, the man whose name had been scraped from every official list with such violence that even the parchment bore scars beneath the tiara. In letters so small they required a magnifying glass, was written in medieval Latin, non fuit, numquam erit. He was not, he will never be. The second seal was the color of bone. It bore the arms of a pope, no chronicle acknowledged, Celestine VI, the hermit who supposedly lived in a cave on Monte Morone in 1294 and refused the throne when the cardinals came begging. The cord holding this seal was knotted exactly 13 times. The third seal was black, pure lampblack mixed with human ash. Luca realized when he leaned close enough to smell it. In its center was the number XX beneath a broken tiara. John Dominiquet, the numeral deliberately skipped in 1276 after the death of John Donatienne, because the cardinals feared the symmetry of 20 Johns would summon something that had been waiting since the 20th chapter of the Apocalypse. Cardinal Vincente spoke for the first time since they had descended. His voice was a dry whisper that barely disturbed the air. 3 popes who never sat on the throne of Peter, 3 names the Church itself declared non-existent. Their seals were placed here in 1099 by Urban II on the very night he proclaimed the First Crusade. He believed that only the authority of men who had never held authority could bind what lies behind this door. Luca reached out and touched the black seal. It was warm, not the warmth of a human hand, but the dull heat of a corpse left in the sun. "Has anyone opened it since?" he asked. Vincente's answer was almost inaudible. No one who returned. The cardinal opened his leather folio and removed a single sheet of vellum no larger than a postcard. On it was a drawing made in iron gall ink, faded but precise, the door exactly as it appeared now, with one addition, a 4th seal, smaller than the rest, placed directly over the keyhole. The 4th seal was blank. Lucas understood. He took the keys of the kingdom from his pocket. The bronze was still sticky with the blood that had wept in the basilica above. He chose the smaller key, the key of knowledge, and pressed its ward against the blank space in the center of the door. Nothing happened for 3 heartbeats. Then the oak sighed, a sound like an old man waking from a long sleep, and the 4th seal appeared of its own accord, not wax, skin, pale, hairless, stretched so thin it was translucent. In its center, branded with a hot iron, was the chi rho of Constantine. The temperature plummeted. Luca felt it first in his teeth, an ache that went straight to the roots, then in his lungs, each breath a blade of ice. The flashlight beam shrank until it was no wider than a pencil. Frost exploded across the walls in fractal feathers, racing toward them like white fire. Cardinal Vincente staggered back, clutching his chest. His lips moved soundlessly. A prayer, or perhaps a name. Luca did not move. He watched as the 3 ancient seals cracked in perfect unison, spiderwebs of fracture spreading outward from their centers. The silk cords turned to powder and drifted to the floor like ash. The door itself did not open. It simply ceased to be there, as though it had never existed, leaving an archway of raw stone, exhaling a breath that smelled of deep catacombs and older things. Beyond was a chamber no larger than a monastic cell. In its center stood a pedestal of black marble. Upon the pedestal rested a single object, a plain iron reliquary the size of a cigar box. its lid sealed with 7 blobs of red wax. Each blob bore the imprint of a different papal ring, but it was not the reliquary that held Luca frozen. It was the frost. It had bloomed across his cassock in the shape of a child's handprint, 5 small fingers splayed wide, directly over his heart. The fabric beneath the print was stiff and white, as though it had been dipped in liquid nitrogen. When he touched it, the cold burned like dry ice beneath the frost. Through layers of wool and skin and bone, he felt something press back, gentle, curious, patient. Cardinal Vincente found his voice at last. It came out as a croak. That mark was on the 3 cardinals who disappeared in 1958. Exactly there. They were found weeks later, wandering the catacombs, babbling in languages no one recognized. All 3 had the same handprint. All 3 died within a year. Their hearts simply stopped. Luca looked down at the frost on his chest. It was already beginning to glisten, as though the handprint were warming from the inside. From the darkness beyond the vanished door came the child's voice again, soft and delighted. 266, it whispered. Closer now, as though it stood just behind the cardinal's shoulder. Vincente did not hear it, or perhaps he had heard it for so long that it no longer registered. Luca took 1 step across the threshold. The iron reliquary on the pedestal began to bleed. 7 thin streams of crimson seeped from beneath the wax seals, running down the sides of the box and pooling on the marble where the blood touched the stone. Letters appeared, burning themselves into the surface like acid. Annulus piscatoris, non mortuus, est soli silentium, aesitur. The ring of the fisherman is not dead, only silenced. The temperature dropped again. Luca's flashlight died with a soft pop, plunging them into absolute black. In that darkness, something brushed the back of his neck, cold fingers tracing the line of his collarbone, pausing directly over the frost handprint on his chest, and the child's voice, intimate now, as though lips pressed against his ear. Welcome home, 267th. Somewhere above them, in the basilica that had stood silent for hours, the great bell of St. Peter's tolled once, a single cracked note that should not have been possible at 4:17 a.m. Cardinal Vincente began to weep without sound. Luca stood motionless in the dark, feeling the small handprint over his heart begin to throb in perfect rhythm with something ancient and vast that had just recognized its own. Chapter 3: The Relic That Still Bleeds on Friday. The darkness inside the chamber was not the absence of light. It was a presence. It pressed against the skin like wet wool, thick and deliberate. Luca's dead flashlight hung useless from his wrist, but he did not need it. A faint red glow now emanated from the iron reliquary on the pedestal, pulsing once every 7 seconds, the rhythm of a dying heart. Cardinal Vincente had not followed him across the threshold. The old man stood frozen in the archway, lips moving in the Jesus prayer, so rapidly the words blurred into a single hiss. His shadow, cast by the red pulse behind Luca, stretched across the floor like spilled ink. Only one shadow, Vincente's own, was missing, as though the darkness had already claimed it. Luca took another step. The air tasted of copper and myrrh. Each breath coated the back of his throat with the memory of old funerals. The frost handprint over his heart burned colder now, a coin of ice soldered to his sternum. Beneath it, his pulse had begun to match the reliquary's glow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Pause again. He reached the pedestal. The iron box was smaller than he had expected, no larger than a missile. Its surface pitted and blackened as though it had been pulled from a fire centuries ago. 7 wax seals, each bearing the imprint of a different fisherman's ring, had fused into the lid like scabs. From beneath them, blood seeped in slow, deliberate threads, tracing the carved grooves of Latin letters that had not been there moments earlier. Luca leaned closer. The blood was fresh, not coagulated, not brown, not ancient, bright arterial red, warm enough that faint steam rose where it touched the cold iron. It moved with purpose, forming the same sentence again and again, over and over, in flowing Aramaic script that hurt to look at directly. Lamute, hut chilwad, shtetiks. He did not die. He was only silenced. The sentence crawled across the lid, reached the edge, dripped to the marble, and began again, an endless rosary of blood. Luca's Latin was fluent, his Greek excellent, his Hebrew passable, but Aramaic came to him like a memory from childhood he had never lived. The words tasted of Galilee dust and the salt of denied tears. He reached out and touched the lid. The iron was warm, not hot. Warm, the temperature of living skin, beneath his fingertip. One of the wax seals cracked with a soft pop, like a knuckle. A bead of blood welled up through the fissure and traced the line of his finger as though recognizing him. It did not drip. It clung, spreading under the skin of his glove in delicate capillaries, spelling the same sentence across his palm in microscopic letters only he could feel. Behind him, Cardinal Vincente finally spoke. His voice cracked like old parchment. That is the original ring, the one St. Peter wore when he was crucified upside down, the one that vanished from his tomb in the 9th century. Every Friday since the year 847, it has bled, only on Friday, only at the hour Christ died. Today was Thursday, October 10th, 2024. Tomorrow would be Friday. Luca lifted the lid. It opened without resistance, as though it had never been sealed at all. Inside, on a bed of black silk rotted to threads, lay the ring. It was simple, a plain band of fisherman's bronze, wide enough to fit a working man's finger, etched with the crude chi-ro that Peter himself was said to have scratched into the wall of the Mamertine prison. No jewels, no inscription, only a dark stain across the inner curve where centuries of papal skin had worn it smooth, and it was bleeding. A single drop welled from the metal itself, from no visible source, gathering until it trembled, then fell with a sound like a tear hitting stone. Another followed, another, each drop perfectly round, perfectly red, perfectly warm. Luca watched them strike the silk and spread into tiny versions of the same Aramaic sentence. He felt the frost handprint on his chest tighten, fingers curling inward, as though whatever had left the mark was now trying to reach inside. Cardinal Vincente's voice floated from the archway, thin and papery. In 1958, when the 3 cardinals opened this chamber for the first time since 1099, they took a sample of the blood. They wanted to know whose it was. The lab in Milan returned the results 3 days later. O negative. Less than 1% of Italians have it. All three cardinals were a positive. They burned the report, then they disappeared. Luca stared at the ring. He had been O negative since birth. His Marine Corps dog tags still carried the marker. He had donated blood exactly twice in his life, once after a roadside bomb in Helmand, once in the seminary infirmary when a novice had hemorrhaged. Both times the nurses had commented on how rare it was for an Italian American. He reached for the ring. His hand did not obey at first. The fingers curled back, resisting, as though some deeper instinct knew better. But the frost handprint pulsed once, hard, like a command, and his arm moved of its own accord. The bronze slipped over his knuckle with a soft, wet sound. It fit perfectly. The moment it seated against his skin, three things happened at once. First, the bleeding stopped. The drops that had been falling every 7 seconds simply ceased, as though a vein had been pinched shut. Second, the temperature in the chamber surged from freezing to blood warm in the space of a heartbeat. The frost on the walls melted into runnels that hissed where they touched the marble. Third, every drop of blood that had ever fallen from the ring since 847 rose from the floor like red mist, swirling upward in a slow vortex that smelled of Golgotha at 3 in the afternoon. The mist coalesced above the pedestal, forming letters in midair, huge and dripping, in how Petrus Wuntlity Schwapper. I am Peter, and you are my third denial. The words hung for a long moment, then collapsed into Luca's open mouth like smoke inhaled against his will. He staggered. For an instant, he was not in the Vatican at all. He was standing on a hillside outside Jerusalem, the sky black with eclipse, the ground trembling. A man hung inverted on a cross, his beard matted with blood and spittle was the man's eyes. Ancient, sorrowful, infinitely patient, looked straight into Luca's own. 3 times the man opened his mouth to speak. 3 times Luca heard himself answer, in a voice not his own, raw with terror. I do not know him. The third denial tore something loose inside Luca's chest. He felt it go, a cold unraveling behind his ribs, as though a thread that had held his soul in place for 37 years had been yanked free. He came back to himself on his knees, gasping. The ring was no longer bronze. It had turned the color of fresh blood, gleaming wetly, as though it had been dipped in a slaughterhouse basin on the inner curve. New letters had appeared, burned into the metal by no human hand. Luca 267, Cardinal Vincente, was no longer in the archway. In his place stood the child, barefoot, dressed in a white baptismal gown yellowed with age, face hidden beneath a veil of long black hair. Its hands were clasped in front of it, fingers interlaced in perfect prayer. Frost radiated from its bare feet, spreading across the floor in delicate spirals. It did not speak aloud. The words formed directly inside Luca's skull, gentle, almost loving. Tomorrow is Friday, Father. The hour comes. The cock will crow for the 3rd time since Golgotha, and someone must answer. The child lifted its veil. There was no face beneath, only a smooth expanse of skin where features should have been, interrupted by a single horizontal mouth that smiled without teeth. Then it was gone. The chamber was empty except for Luca and the open reliquary. The ring on his finger pulsed once, warm and heavy. like a second heart, far above, in the basilica that had stood silent for nearly 1,000 years. The great clock in the left transept began to strike the hour it had never been allowed to strike, 3:33 in the morning, and somewhere in the city, a rooster that had no business being inside the Vatican walls lifted its head and crowed. Chapter 4: The Pope Who Was Buried Alive in 896. The corridor back up felt longer than the descent. Every step rang with the hollow finality, as though the stone itself resented being walked upon twice in one night. Cardinal Vincente had vanished completely. No footsteps, no cassock rustle, no ragged breathing. Yet Luca was not alone. The ring on his finger throbbed in counter rhythm to his heart, a second pulse that grew stronger with every meter he climbed. He emerged beneath the papal altar at 4:58 a.m. The basilica above was no longer silent. A low murmuring filled the vaulted spaces, like 1,000 people whispering the Agnus Dei at once. But when Luca looked up, the pews were empty. The sound came from the marble itself, from the statues, from the very bronze of Bernini's baldacchino. The building was speaking in tongues. He did not stop. He walked straight through the north transept, past the chapel of the column where Peter's chains are kept, and down a side passage reserved for the Sampietrini. At the end was an unmarked iron door, no wider than a coffin lid, Vincente's master key, left hanging from the lock as though the cardinal had simply dissolved, turned without resistance. Beyond lay the Specula Sagrada, the secret observatory, a narrow room few living souls have ever seen. It is not an observatory of stars. It is an observatory of failures. Shelves of black walnut rose to the ceiling. Filled with objects the church has spent 2 millennia pretending do not exist. The iron crown worn by the antipope Anacletus II, the tongue of John the Baptist that refused to burn in 1453, the complete, flayed skin of the demon Asmodeus, tanned and bound into a folio. In the center of the room stood a lectern of human thigh bones mortared together. Upon it rested a single volume bound in lead, the Cadaver Synod Transcript, January 897, 9 parchment leaves, each the color of nicotine, written in a hand that begins neat and ends in frantic claw marks. Luca opened it with fingers that no longer felt as entirely his own. The first page was in Latin, the official record everyone knows. Acta Synodi Cadaverica, in nomine Domini nostri, Jesu Christi, anno incarnationis, aius dis sefelisvins, mense Januario, sub Stephanos Sextus, Pontifice Maximo. He turned to the pages, the ink changed. It became thicker, darker, smelling faintly of earth and vinegar. The script was no longer Latin, but a dialect that hurt the eyes. Late Latin mixed with something older, something that predated even the Vulgate, and the words were not written, they were pressed into the vellum by fingernails. The transcript of the 9 minutes when the corpse of Pope Formosus spoke. Luca began to read aloud, because the ring on his finger tightened like a tourniquet, until he did. Anno Domini 896, 12 mensis Januari, ora tertia post meridiem, ego formosus, olim episcopus portuensis, nunc cadaver, loquor non mea voluntate sed per os meum, aperitur ab eo qui non mortus est. I speak not by my own will, but through my mouth is opened by him who did not die. The temperature in the spicola plunged again. The breath froze in Luca's throat. The corpse had continued. They think they judge me. They prop my rotting body on the throne, dress me in pontifical robes that stink of the grave, place the triple crown on my worm eaten skull. They ask me if I sinned by accepting Porto after Rome. They ask me if I crowned a bastard emperor. Fools, I am only the door they forced open when they dug me from my tomb. A pause in the text, a stain shaped like a handprint. Then the handwriting changed, became smaller, hurried, as though the scribe were terrified of what came next. The thing that wears Peter's ring entered my mouth at the moment of death. It has waited 900 years for a tongue that will not rot. It has tasted every pope since. None were sweet enough. None were guilty enough. It needs the third denial spoken aloud again, spoken by one who bears the keys and the blood and the name that completes the count. Here the parchment was torn, as though someone had tried to rip the page out and failed. The final lines were written in a different ink, bright arterial red that had never dried. Audite filii tenebrarum. On the 13th day of the 10th month of the year, 2024, after my passion, a priest bearing the name Luca Rossi, born of woman in the city of Baltimore, marked with my blood O negative, will descend. He will be the 267th. He will wear my ring willingly or unwillingly. And when the cock crows the third time since Golgotha, he will open his mouth and say the words I could not say on the night I betrayed my Lord. I do not know the man. Then the keys will turn backward, the gates will open downward, and the silence I have carried for 2,000 years will finally be broken. Pray, brothers, pray he refuses, pray he fails. Because if he speaks those words with papal authority, the light that was spoken on the first day will hear its own denial and go out forever. The last line was not written. It was burned into the parchment with a branding iron in the shape of the fisherman's ring. Luca stared at the date, October 13th, 2004. Today was October 10th. In 3 days, the cock would crow for the third time. He closed the book. The lead cover slammed shut by itself, hard enough to crack the bone lectern. Every object in the Spicola Segreta began to weep. The iron crown dripped tears of rust. The tongue of John the Baptist bled from its severed root. The flayed demon's skin rippled as though trying to scream without lungs. And from somewhere far below, deeper than the necropolis, deeper than the red wall where Peter's bones are kept, came the slow, deliberate sound of a body dragging itself across stone, one limb at a time, toward the staircase Luca had just climbed. The ring on his finger burned white hot. He looked down. The metal had begun to change again. The bronze was now gold, old, soft gold, the color of Middle Eastern sunsets, and across the outer face, letters were rising like blisters, LUCAPAPA267, Luca Papa 267. He tore at the ring. It would not budge. The skin beneath it was already black, as though gangrene had set in within seconds. The dragging sound grew closer. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. He ran. He burst from the Spicola into the transept at 5:41 a.m., cassock soaked with sweat despite the cold, the ring pulsing like a coal against his bone. The basilica was still empty. Yet every statue of every pope, from Linus to Francis, had turned its marble head to watch him pass. Their stone eyes followed him with the patience of things that have waited 12 centuries for one man. He reached the sacristy door, flung it open, and collided with Cardinal Vincente. The old man was standing motionless in the center of the room, arms hanging limp, eyes wide and filmed with frost. His lips were blue. A thin line of blood had frozen in a perfect vertical streak from his left ear to his collar. As though something had whispered too close, Luca grabbed his shoulders. Eminence? Vincente's head turned with mechanical slowness. When he spoke, it was not his voice. It was the child's voice, soft and genderless and ancient. You read the words, Luca Rossi. You let them in. Now the corpse comes to thank the scribe who kept his promise. Vincente's right hand rose, slowly, lovingly, and pressed against Luca's chest, directly over the frost handprint. The cardinal's palm was warm, impossibly warm. The frost melted instantly, leaving only raw, reddened skin in the perfect shape of a child's fingers. Vincente smiled with lips that no longer belonged to him. 3 days, Father, 3 days until Friday. The cock is already in the courtyard. It has been there since 33 AD, waiting for the third voice. Then the cardinal's eyes rolled white, and he collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. Luca caught him before he hit the marble. Vincente weighed nothing at all, as though his bones had been hollowed out and filled with ash from the depths of the basilica. The dragging sound reached the top of the hidden staircase. Thud, scrape, pause. Thud, scrape, pause. Closer. Luca looked at the ring. It was bleeding again. A single drop slid us over the golden surface and fell to the floor, where it wrote, in perfect Aramaic, "The third denial is coming, and this time it will be spoken by a pope somewhere outside, in the Vatican gardens, where no rooster has ever been permitted." A cock crowed once, clear, defiant, ancient. The sound echoed off the dome like the first crack in the world. Chapter 5. The night the confessionals spoke back, October 11th, 2024, Friday. 1942. The basilica should have been locked tight, yet every side door stood ajar, as though the building itself had exhaled and forgotten to breathe in again. A cold wind moved through the nave in slow, deliberate spirals, lifting the corners of altar cloths and making the votive flames bow like penitents. Outside, Rome was preparing for the Angelus of the Dead, the nightly ritual where the city's churches ring a single bell for souls in purgatory. But inside St. Peter's, the bells remained silent. They were listening. Luca had not slept in 51 hours. The ring on his finger had swollen to the size of a man's knuckle, the gold now veined with black, as though corruption were threading through the metal like ivy. It no longer came off when he tried to saw it with a scalpel borrowed from the Vatican pharmacy. The blade melted into slag. The skin beneath was raw and shining, the color of fresh liver. He walked the perimeter of the confessionals that lined the right aisle, 27 of them, ancient oak boxes carved with scenes of the prodigal son and the woman taken in adultery. Each grill was closed, each kneeler empty, yet every single one was occupied. He could feel them. The air inside the boxes was thicker, warmer, humid with breath that had no lungs, a faint smell of lilies left too long in holy water, sweet and rotting at the same time, and beneath that, something coppery, menstrual, like the scent of a miscarriage in a sacristy. Luca stopped at the third confessional from the Pietà Chapel. The velvet curtain on the penitent's side twitched, though there was no wind. He knelt. The kneeler creaked under his weight, the sound obscenely loud in the hush. The grill between priest and penitent was carved walnut, darkened by centuries of foreheads pressed in shame. Through the lattice he could see nothing but shadow. Then the shadow spoke, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The voice belonged to a woman, young, Roman accent from the Trastevere quarter, but the timbre was wrong, like a recording played at half speed underwater. My last confession was never. A pause. The smell of lilies intensified until Luca's eyes watered. "I killed my husband," the voice continued, conversational, almost amused. "With a hammer, while he slept. He snored so loudly after the baby came. I wrapped him in the shower curtain. The blood soaked through and made the plastic stick to the tiles. I remember thinking the pattern looked like the Shroud of Turin." Luca's mouth went dry. The woman on the other side of the grill was not there. He could see the empty kneeler, the undisturbed dust on the seat. Yet her breath fogged the lattice in perfect circles. "I buried him under the lemon tree in the courtyard," she whispered. "Every spring the fruit tastes of iron. I squeeze the juice on my salads and pretend it's just the soil." A soft laugh, intimate, right against the grill. "But tonight, Father, tonight he forgives me." From the darkness came the sound of lips kissing wood. Once, twice, 3 times, the kiss of peace. Then a man's voice, thick with earth and decomposition. "Carla, I forgive you. Come home." The curtain billowed outward as though someone had stood up too quickly. The confessional was empty. Luca backed away on his knees. Next box. An old man this time, voice cracked with Parkinson's. "I aborted our daughter in 1973, clinic on Via Salaria. The doctor used a vacuum. I heard it, like a hoover sucking up gravel. I paid extra for the anesthesia so she wouldn't feel it. But she did. She screamed the whole way down the tube." Silence. Then a child's voice, thin and piping, from inside the womb that no longer existed. "Papa, why is it so dark?" The old man began to sob, wet, choking sounds that went on and on until the wood itself seemed to weep. Luca fled down the aisle. Every confessional was the same. A Swiss guard sergeant heard his mother, dead 20 years of cancer, listing the ways he had failed her. A German tourist heard her unborn son reciting the Hail Mary backward while his tiny fists beat against the inside of the wood. A nun heard the voice of the little girl she had drowned in the convent font in 1947, asking why the water had been so cold. The voices did not shout. They whispered. They seduced. They forgave. Luca's phone was in his hand before he realized he had taken it out. He pressed record and held it to the grill of the central confessional, the one directly beneath the chair of Peter. Silence for 7 seconds, then his own voice, clear, calm, undeniably his. "Bless me, Father, for I will sin." A pause, the sound of a throat clearing. The same nervous tick Luca had whenever he was about to lie. On the 13th of October, 2024, at 3:33 in the afternoon, I will stand before the high altar of this basilica. I will wear the ring of the fisherman, and I will deny him 3 times with full papal authority. His recorded voice laughed, soft, self loathing, intimate. The first denial will be for the Father, the second for the Son, the third. The third will be for the one who asked me if I loved him and heard only silence, a wet sound, like a tongue running over teeth. I will watch the light go out of the world, Father, and I will smile, because finally someone else will carry the weight I was born to bear. The recording ended with the unmistakable click of the ring tapping against the grill, tap and tap and tap, 3 times, like Peter's cock crowing in the courtyard. Luca played it back. The timestamp read 1957:33. He had pressed record at 1957:26, 7 seconds of silence, then 33 seconds of his future murder of God. His knees buckled. He sat hard on the marble, phone clutched to his chest like a crucifix. The screen still glowed with the waveform, a perfect, terrifying heartbeat. From every confessional at once came the soft rustle of kneelers being used, 27 invisible penitents rising to receive absolution that would never come. Then, in perfect unison, 27 dead voices spoke the words of forgiveness. Ego te absolvo e peccatis tuis. But the Latin was wrong. The verbs were future tense. I will absolve you. I will forgive you when you have done it. The temperature in the basilica plummeted so fast that the moisture in the air crystallized into snow. Fat, lazy flakes drifted down through the dome, melting on the statue's stone cheeks like tears. Luca looked at his phone again. The recording had grown. A new segment. Time-stamped 1959:59, 2 minutes in the future. His own voice, hoarse now, pleading, "Don't make me say it. Please, I'm not strong enough to carry this." Another voice answered, ancient, Galilean accent thick as fig wine. "You were never meant to be strong, shaman. You were only meant to be the rock I break myself against." The cock crowed a second time, somewhere in the Vatican gardens, impossibly loud, impossibly close. Luca stood. The ring on his finger was bleeding again, thick drops that spattered the marble and wrote, in looping cursive, 2 days he ran, past the confessionals where the dead were still whispering their future sins, past the Pietà where Mary's stone face had cracked in a perfect, silent scream, into the night that smelled of confession and coming betrayal behind him. The 27 confessionals fell silent one by one, like candles snuffed by an unseen hand. The last to go quiet was the central one. From its darkness drifted a final breath, warm against the back of his neck, though he was already 20 meters away. "See you on Sunday. Father, the cock only needs one more voice." Chapter 6. The Cardinal Who Never Casts a Shadow. October 12th, 2024, Saturday, 02:14 a.m. Luca had not left the Vatican walls in 6 days. He moved through the city-state like a ghost in reverse, seen by everyone, noticed by no one. The Swiss guards saluted him out of habit, but their eyes slid past the place where his shadow should have been. The ring had begun to drink light as well as blood, where it touched his skin. Darkness pooled and spread, a bruise that refused to heal. He had one destination left. The Archivio Fotografico Segreto occupied a forgotten wing beneath the Cortile della Pina, a narrow corridor lined with steel cabinets that smelled of silver nitrate and old fear. No one had entered since 2019, when the last archivist retired and simply never returned. The door was locked with a padlock the color of dried bone. Luca's master key, Vincente's key, turned it without resistance inside. The air was refrigerated to 4 degrees to preserve the film. Rows of metal drawers rose to the ceiling like organ pipes. Each drawer was labeled in neat Vatican handwriting, Conclavi 1831 2023. Luca went straight to 1958, drawer 58C, a single reel of Sitza black and white film, Kodak Tri-X, still in its yellow and black box. Handwritten on the lid in fountain pen ink, Conclave, 25 sul 28 ottobre 1958, Cameras di sicurezza, Sala del pianto in Cappella, Sistina. Non aprire senza autorizzazione del Camerlengo. Luca carried the reel to the ancient Steinbeck editing table in the corner. The machine wheezed to life like a dying accordion. He threaded the film with fingers that trembled only slightly. The first frames were time-stamped 26 October 1958, 1947. Grainy, high-contrast image. The Sala del Pianto, the Room of Tears, where the newly elected pope first puts on the white cassock. 3 cardinals stood in a loose triangle, faces pale with exhaustion and something close to terror. They were the same 3 whose files had been burned, whose names were whispered only in the third person: Cardinal Ottaviani, Cardinal Masella, Cardinal Confalonieri. Behind them, half a step back, stood a younger Cardinal Vincente, 43 years old, black hair, sharp Roman nose, the same pale gray eyes Luca knew so well. Vincente was smiling, but the smile did not reach the eyes. The camera was fixed, ceiling mounted, no sound. The 3 cardinals turned and walked toward the door that led to the Sistine Chapel balcony for the Habemus Papam announcement. Their shadows stretched long across the marble under the harsh floodlights, 3 distinct, dark silhouettes, crisp-edged. Cardinal Vincente followed. He cast no shadow at all, the film continued. Vincente walked directly beneath the camera, where his feet passed. The marble remained brightly lit, as though a hole had been cut in the light itself. The 3 cardinals ahead of him threw shadows that overlapped and merged like spilled ink. Vincente's absence of shadow was not subtle, it was absolute, a moving void that made the film itself look damaged. Luca froze the frame. He leaned so close his breath fogged the glass plate in the still image. Vincente's feet were clearly visible, the hem of his scarlet cassock brushing the floor. But beneath him, the marble was the same tone as the wall behind. No gradient, no darkening, nothing. He let the film run. The 4 men entered the Sistine Chapel. The camera switched to another fixed lens above Michelangelo's Last Judgment. The 3 cardinals knelt before the new Pope John XXIII, who stood trembling in his too large cassock. Their shadows pooled around them like spilled oil. Vincente knelt as well. Still no shadow. John XXIII raised his hand in blessing. The moment his fingers formed the sign of the cross, Vincente's head snapped up. His mouth opened impossibly wide, far wider than human anatomy allowed, and for exactly 3 frames, the inside of his mouth was not dark. It was lit from within by a cold, white light that had no source. Then the film ended. The leader scratched through the gate with a sound like tearing paper. Luca sat back. The refrigeration unit hummed. Somewhere in the stacks, a drawer slid open by itself and closed again. He understood now why Vincente had always insisted on meeting after sunset. why he walked only beneath the floodlights in the colonnades, why his photographs after 1958 were always taken indoors or at night. He understood the faint smell of formaldehyde that clung to the cardinal's cassock, the way his skin never quite warmed when they shook hands. Vincente had died in that conclave. Something wearing Vincente's body had been walking the Vatican for 66 years, kept animated by the same entity that now wore the fisherman's ring on Luca's finger. He left the archive at so threst 12 a.m. The corridors were lit by emergency strips that glowed the color of old bone. Every security camera he passed swiveled to follow him, red LEDs blinking in perfect synchrony with the pulse in the ring. He found Vincente in the Borgia apartment, standing motionless before the Pinturicchio fresco of the Resurrection. The room was unlit, but moonlight fell through the high windows in silver blades. Luca closed the door behind him. Vincente did not turn. On the parquet floor, the moonlight painted everything in sharp contrast: the intricate inlay, the cardinal's scarlet slippers, the hem of his cassock, no shadow. "You knew," Luca said. His voice was hoarse from disuse. Vincente's reflection in the polished floor was perfect, every fold of fabric, every wrinkle in the aged face, except for one detail. The reflection cast a shadow, long and dark, stretching toward Luca like a pleading hand. The real Vincente had none. "I have known since 1958, the cardinal said. The voice was the same dry whisper, but now it carried an echo, as though spoken inside a tomb. "The three cardinals opened the chamber. They saw what you saw. They tried to close it again. The entity needed a custodian, someone to walk in daylight, to speak with authority, to prepare the way." He turned slowly. His face was Vincente's, but the skin had the waxy sheen of a corpse prepared for viewing. The eyes were filmed with the same frost Luca had seen in the archive footage. "It chose me because I was ambitious," Vincente continued. "Ambition is a kind of hunger. Hunger can be redirected." Luca raised his right hand. The ring caught the moonlight and drank it, becoming a circle of absolute black. "And now it chooses me." Vincente smiled. The expression was gentle, almost paternal. "It has always chosen you, Luca. I was only the bridge. 66 years of borrowed time to keep the door from slamming shut. Tomorrow is the 13th, Friday, the hour Christ died." He stepped forward, where his foot touched the floor. The moonlight dimmed, as though a cloud had passed over the window, though the sky was clear. "The entity is not evil," Vincente whispered. "It is wounded. Peter's denial was never forgiven. Not truly. The wound has festered for 2,000 years. It needs a pope to speak the denial again, willingly, with full authority. Then the wound can close, the silence can end, and the light can finally go out." Luca backed away until his shoulders met the door. "You would let the world die. I would let the world rest," Vincente said. 6 million years of screaming, one moment of silence. Is that not mercy? He reached into his cassock and withdrew a small silver box, the kind used for viaticum, the last sacraments. Inside lay a single white host, and beside it, a communion chalice no larger than a thimble, filled with dark, viscous blood that moved when it should not. "Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, Vincente said. "You will celebrate the Mass of the Third Denial, alone, Beneath the high altar, you will wear the ring, you will consecrate, and when the cock crows the third time, you will say the words. He held out the host. It was already bleeding from the center, a single drop tracing the Greek letters ICXC Nika. Luca's hand rose without his consent. The ring pulled it forward like a magnet. Vincente's smile widened. Take, eat. This is the body that will be given up. For silence. Luca's fingers brushed the host. The moment skin touched wafer, every light in the Borgia apartment went out. In the absolute dark, Vincente's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Welcome to the conclave that never ended. Father, the cardinals are still waiting. They never left the room. From the walls came the soft rustle of scarlet silk, as though dozens of long-dead princes of the church were turning to watch. And beneath it all, the slow, patient dragging sound that had followed Luca since the cadaver transcript began again, closer now, thud, scrape, thud, scrape. Vincente's final words were a lover's whisper against Luca's ear, though the cardinal stood 3 meters away. Tomorrow you will be pope for 9 minutes, just like Formosus, just long enough to finish what Peter started. The lights flickered back on. The room was empty. Only the host remained, lying in the center of the floor. It had been nailed there with a single iron spike through the middle, the blood from the wound spelled, in perfect Aramaic, 1 day outside, in the Cortile di San Damaso. The cock crowed for the first time in daylight. Chapter 7. The Ring Chooses Its Next Finger. October 12th, 2024, Saturday. 2247, Feast of St. John Moritres, the Pope who opened the door in 1958. Luca had barricaded himself in the old papal apartment above the Arch of the Bells. The suite used only when a pope dies, and the church must wait for the funeral. The rooms had not been aired since April 2005. The air tasted of candle smoke and the faint sweetness of embalming fluid that never quite leaves the walls. He sat on the bare mattress, knees drawn to chest, staring at his right hand. The ring was gone. It had slipped off while he slept, if the twitching unconsciousness of the last hours could be called sleep, leaving a perfect circle of blackened flesh, raw and wet, as though the metal had been soldered on with acid. The wound wept a clear fluid that smelled of myrrh and ozone on the parquet floor. The fisherman's ring waited. It no longer looked like a ring. It had elongated, the gold band splitting into 8 delicate segments that moved independently, like the legs of a spider. The bezel, once a simple chi row, had become a cluster of tiny jointed mandibles that clicked softly when it tasted the air. It crouched in the center of a blood-drawn circle, the Aramaic sentence from the reliquary repeating endlessly, "He did not die, he was only silenced." Every few minutes it would scuttle a few centimeters, testing, tasting, then freeze again when Luca's gaze fell on it. He had tried to crush it with the bronze crucifix from the wall. The crucifix bent like wax. He had tried holy water. The ring drank it and grew fatter. He had tried fire. The flame bowed away as though afraid. Now he simply watched. At 23:11, the temperature in the room began to fall with the precision of a liturgical season changing. Frost feathered across the windows that overlooked the darkened piazza. The ring's movements became more purposeful. It circled the room counterclockwise, Widdershins, the direction of unmaking. pausing beneath each papal portrait in turn. Pius XIII rejected St. John the XXIII, rejected Paul VI, rejected John Paul the Reviews, rejected John Paul II, rejected Benedict XVI, rejected Francis, rejected. It returned to the center and reared up on four of its golden legs, the mandibles opening and closing in what might have been frustration. Luca understood. None of them had been the 267th. The number had been forbidden since 1276, when the cardinals deliberately skipped John the Fifth to avoid the apocalyptic symmetry of 20 Johns. The sequence had been broken on purpose, a tiny act of rebellion against prophecy. No pope could ever be 267 because the church itself had erased the possibility. Until now, at 2333 exactly. The door to the antechamber opened by itself. Cardinal Vincente entered, or what wore Vincente's body. He moved with the stiff grace of a marionette whose strings were held by someone very far away. His shadow was still missing. But tonight the absence was more pronounced. The moonlight falling through the window illuminated the floor behind him as though he were a hole cut in the world. In his hands, he carried a small red leather folder sealed with the umbraculum, the black and gold umbrella that signifies sede vacante. He laid it on the table beside Luca's bed. "Open it," he said. The voice was Vincente's, but layered beneath it was the deeper resonance of a Galilean fisherman speaking Aramaic through a corpse. Luca's hands moved without permission. The ring on the floor paused, legs trembling with anticipation. Inside the folder were 3 documents. The first, a single sheet of parchment dated October 6th, 2024, the night Luca arrived. Written in crimson ink that still looked wet, Acta Conclavis Occulti, in the name of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, on the 6th day of October, in the year of our Lord 2024, we, the undersigned princes of the Church, having been compelled by signs and wonders, do hereby declare that a hidden conclave was held in the necropolis beneath the confession at the hour when the keys refused to turn. The second document, a list of names, 17 cardinals, all dead, some for centuries. Their signatures were perfect forgeries, but the parchment bore the unmistakable indentations of real quill pens pressed by real hands. The third, such the decree itself, Nos Cardinales Sanctae Romanae Ecclesiae, in conclavio culto congregati, declaramus et definimus, Lucam Rossi Presbyterum Americanum electum, esse in summum pontificem, sub numero CCLice setiens, qui numquam numeratus fuerat, et qui numquam numerari debuerat. We declare and define Luca Rossi, American priest, to have been elected Supreme Pontiff under the number 267, which was never counted and which should never have been counted, at the bottom, in the same crimson ink, Habemus Papam, the cock has been waiting. Luca stared at the parchment until the words blurred. I was elected, he whispered, without my knowledge, without my consent. You were elected the moment you were conceived, Vincente replied. The entity has been preparing the womb of history for 2,000 years. Every pope since Celestine V has been a rehearsal. You are the performance. The ring on the floor began to move again, faster now, legs clicking across the parquet like golden rain. It circled Luca's bare feet, testing the air above his toes, his ankles, his knees. It was choosing. Vincente knelt, an old man's bones cracking like dry wood, and spoke to the ring as one speaks to a beloved but dangerous pet. Not yet, Karasim. He must accept freely. That is the rule Peter himself set. The third denial must be voluntary. The ring paused, mandibles quivering. Luca felt it then, the pull, not physical, deeper, a hollowing behind his sternum where the frost handprint had been, as though something was inflating inside his rib cage, making room. Images flooded him. He saw himself standing at the high altar tomorrow afternoon, vested in the white cassock that had been sewn in secret and hung in the wardrobe behind him. He saw the ring crawling up his arm like a living bracelet, sliding over the blackened wound, fusing to the bone. He saw his mouth opening, not by his will, and speaking the three denials in Aramaic, Latin, and finally in the language that existed before Babel. He saw the light going out, not metaphorically, the sun itself guttering like a candle in wind, the stars winking out one by one, the moon turning bloodless and cold, and in that final darkness, a single voice, Peter's voice, raw with 2,000 years of unshed tears, whispering at last, "Thank you, my son. Now I can sleep." The vision broke. Luca was on his knees, retching bile that tasted of Galilee seawater. Vincente stood over him, gentle, almost tender. The church has survived anti-popes, schisms, wars, scandals, he said. It will not survive the truth as spoken by a legitimate pope. That is why the number was forbidden. That is why you were hidden in the American desert, raised far from Rome, ordained in obscurity. You are the contingency the church prayed would never be needed. The ring scuttled closer. One golden leg brushed Luca's bare toe. It was warm, loving, hungry. "Put it on," Vincente whispered. "End the silence. Let Peter die. Let the world rest." Luca looked at the wardrobe. The white cassock hung there, swaying though there was no wind. On the hanger beside it, the pallium, the stole of Peter, the triregno that had not been worn since 1963, all in his size. He understood now why no pope had ever been able to destroy the ring, why every attempt to bury it deeper, to seal it in lead, to drown it in holy water, had failed. It was waiting for its rightful finger, the 267th, the one who would finally say yes. The ring reared up on its hind legs, mandibles opening wide enough to reveal a tiny, perfect tongue of flame inside, the same cold white light that had shone from Vincente's mouth in 1958. It began to sing, not with sound, with memory. Luca saw Peter on the night of the denial, the courtyard fire, the servant girl's accusing finger, the cock crowing, the bitter tears. He felt the weight of 2 millennia of guilt pressing down on one man's shoulders until the bones cracked. He felt the mercy of it, to take that weight, to let the fisherman finally lay down his nets. The ring crawled up his ankle, slow and deliberate, leaving a trail of warmth that felt like forgiveness. Luca did not move, not yet. Outside, in the piazza that had seen every papal coronation for 1,000 years, the obelisk that Caligula brought from Egypt began to weep blood from its apex. The ring reached his knee. Vincente watched with the serene expression of a priest at the moment of consecration. "Tomorrow is Friday," he said softly. "The hour is almost here. The cock is in the courtyard, It has grown old waiting for your voice. The ring paused at the hem of Luca's cassock, mandibles trembling with something that might have been love. It waited for permission. Luca looked at the red folder one last time. The decree of the hidden conclave, his election, his damnation, or his salvation. He closed his eyes and whispered the single word the entity had been waiting 2,000 years to hear from a pope. Come. The ring surged upward like golden lightning, flowing over skin and cloth and bone, fusing to the blackened wound with a sound like a kiss. When Luca opened his eyes, the room was full of cardinals, 17 of them, translucent as smoke, wearing the scarlet of centuries past. They knelt in perfect silence, heads bowed, waiting for their pope, the 267th. The last, Vincente bowed lowest of all. Sancte Pater, he said, and for the first time in 66 years, his voice still held genuine joy. Welcome home, far below. In the hidden chamber where the reliquary had waited since 1099, the iron box opened by itself. It was empty. The ring had found its finger at last, and in the Vatican gardens, the cock, ancient, featherless, eyes milky with cataracts, lifted its head toward the papal window and prepared to crow for the third and final time. Chapter 8. The Silence That Swallowed the Sistine Chapel, October 13th, 2024, Friday, 1451, 1 hour and 42 minutes before the hour of none, the hour Christ died. Luca woke on the cold marble floor of the Sala Regia, the vast antechamber that connects the Pauline Chapel to the Sistine. He had no memory of leaving the papal apartment. He had no memory of walking here in the white cassock that now clung to him like a shroud soaked in sweat and myrrh. The pallium weighed on his shoulders like a chain of lead. The stole of Peter, the original, frayed and yellowed, lay across his neck and smelled of the sea. The ring was on his finger, not the spider thing that had crawled, the true ring, simple bronze again, wide and ancient, warm as living skin. It fit as though his hand had been grown for it. He did not remember putting it on. The Sala Regia was empty, yet every suit of armor along the walls had turned its helmeted head toward him. The painted eyes of the frescoed emperors followed his every breath. Somewhere in the distance, a clock that had been removed in 1963 began to strike the hour it had never been allowed to strike. He stood. His bare feet left no sound on the marble, not even the soft slap of skin on stone. He tried to speak, called his own name, called for Vincente, called for God, but no voice came, only the movement of his tongue against teeth, the rush of air through a throat that produced nothing. Silence had already begun. He walked, floated, through the open doors, into the Sistine Chapel. The chapel was full. Hundreds of people stood motionless beneath Michelangelo's vault, Swiss guards with halberds frozen mid-gesture, nuns with rosaries tangled in rigid fingers, tourists whose phones had frozen mid-photo, a group of seminarians on their knees, mouths open in the act of singing the Salve Regina, all of them silent, all of them staring upward. Luca followed their gaze. The ceiling had changed, every image of God, the Creator stretching toward Adam, the separation of light from darkness, the hurling of the rebel angels, had altered while no one watched. The hand of God the Father, once extended in blessing toward Adam's languid finger, now pointed straight down, down toward the floor, down toward Luca, in every panel. The divine finger accused, the ignudi, the athletic nude youths who framed the scenes, had turned their faces away in horror. Some covered their eyes, others wept blood that ran in perfect, unmoving streaks. The last judgment on the apse wall was worse. Christ the Judge, once rising in majesty, now hung inverted, arms spread in the exact posture of Peter on his cross. The blessed ascending to heaven were falling, the damned rising. The scales of judgment had shattered, and the souls spilled out like grain from a torn sack. And in the center of the chaos, Charon's boat was empty. The damned had already disembarked. Luca felt the silence enter him, not absence of sound, absence of everything that makes sound possible. No heartbeat in his ears, no blood rushing, no breath. His lungs were still, yet he did not suffocate. Time had paused inside his body as surely as it had outside. He looked at his chest. The frost handprint was gone. In its place, a perfect circle of gold, the exact size of the fisherman's ring, had been branded into his flesh, directly over his heart. The skin was blistered, shining, the lines of the chiro raised like scar tissue. The ring on his finger pulsed once, and the silence began to count. He felt it, rather than heard it, a pressure behind his eyes, a ticking in the bones of his inner ear. 7 minutes and 14 seconds. The exact length of the cadaver synod speech in 897, measured by the Vatican's own archivists using the original wax cylinder recording discovered in 1937 and immediately locked away again. The silence was the speech. The speech was the silence. Luca understood, with the clarity of a dream that will not end, that every soul in the Sistine Chapel was hearing the corpse of Pope Formosus speak inside their skulls, the 9-minute oration delivered through dead lips, now stretched across the world like a shroud. He fell to his knees beneath the altar. The papal throne, Pauline chair, waited for him, empty since John Paul II. On its cushion lay the triregno, the triple crown that had been abolished but never destroyed. The ring pulled him toward it. He resisted for 1 heartbeat, 2, then his body stood without him. He watched himself walk, no glide, to the throne, watched himself sit, watched himself place the triple crown on his own head with hands that were not his. The weight of it crushed thought, and the silence deepened. Now he heard, felt the words, not in Latin, not in Aramaic, in the language that existed before sound, when God was still alone with his own silence. The corpse of Formosus spoke through the chapel, through the Vatican, through every church bell that had ever tolled for a dying pope. Behold the 267th. Behold the one who was never counted. Behold the rock upon which the church will break itself at last. The frescoed prophets on the walls began to weep dust. Isaiah's mouth opened in a silent scream. Jeremiah tore his beard in handfuls that fell as ash, and on the ceiling, in the panel of the creation of Adam, the finger of God touched Adam's at last. But the touch was not life-giving. It was accusatory. Adam's body convulsed. His skin blistered where the divine finger met his own. The spark of life reversed, flowing backward into the hand of God like water sucked up a straw. Adam aged 1,000 years in a heartbeat, withering to bones, to dust, to nothing. The finger withdrew. Where Adam had been, only a void remained, a hole in the fresco that looked down into absolute black. The silence reached 6 minutes and 47 seconds. Luca felt the words rising in his throat. Not his words, Peter's words. The third denial, perfected, purified, ready to be spoken with the full authority of the keys. His mouth opened. The ring burned white hot, fusing to bone. And in that moment, every person in the chapel, the guards, the nuns, the tourists, the seminarians, turned their heads as one to look at him. Their eyes were empty, not blind, empty, hollow sockets that reflected nothing. They were not people anymore. They were witnesses. The silence reached 7 minutes and 10 seconds. Luca's tongue moved since the first denial formed, ancient, inevitable. He felt the world lean in to listen. Then something broke the silence. Not sound, memory. A single, fragile memory from Fallujah, 2007. A child, no older than 10, running toward his Humvee with a bouquet of desert flowers. The day before the IED that took his hearing for 3 weeks and his faith for longer. The child's smile, the way the flowers smelled of dust and hope. The memory struck him like a physical blow. He clamped his teeth shut. The denial died unborn. The silence shattered. Sound returned with the violence of a dam breaking. Heartbeats thundering, lungs gasping. The collective scream of hundreds of throats that had forgotten how to breathe. The frescoes screamed with them. God's finger on the ceiling snapped back to its original position so violently that flakes of plaster rained down like snow. The void where Adam had been filled again, not with the original figure, but with something new. Adam, reaching upward, but his finger was missing. Cut off cleanly at the first joint. In its place, a circle of gold, the fisherman's ring, embedded in the fresco, bleeding. The people in the chapel collapsed as one, sobbing, retching, praying in languages they did not know. Luca remained on the throne. The triple crown had fallen. The pallium lay in shreds. The ring on his finger was bronze again, simple, ancient. But the brand over his heart was gone. In its place, a perfect circle of scar tissue. And inside the scar, a single word in letters of raised flesh. No, he had refused, for now. The chapel doors burst open. Swiss guards poured in, faces pale with terror, halberds trembling. They stopped when they saw him. One by one, they knelt, not to Luca Rossi, to the 267th, the Pope who had said no, outside, in the piazza. The obelisk stopped bleeding. The cock in the gardens fell silent. And somewhere deep beneath the Vatican, in the chamber that had waited since 1089, the corpse of Pope Formosus opened its blind eyes and wept a single tear of pure, perfect light. The silence had been broken, but the third denial had only been delayed. The ring tightened on Luca's finger. Patient as stone, it could wait. It had waited 2,000 years already. One more refusal only made the final yes sweeter. Chapter 9. The Last Fisherman, October 13th, 2024, Friday, 1533. Exactly 3 o'clock, the hour Christ died. The Sistine Chapel had been evacuated. The unconscious were carried out on stretchers. The hysterical were sedated. Only the Swiss guards remained, forming a silent ring of steel around the papal throne. Their faces were gray, eyes wide, as though they had looked into the ark and lived. Luca sat alone beneath the restored ceiling. Adam's finger was whole again, But the spark between God and man now flickered, weak and uncertain. The fresco seemed to breathe with the chapel, rising and falling like a dying lung. The ring on his finger was quiet. For the first time in 7 days, it did not pulse, did not bleed, did not crawl. It simply waited. A door opened behind the altar screen, the small, unmarked door used only for the Pope's private entrance. Cardinal Vincente entered, moving with the careful steps of a man walking on thin ice. Behind him came no one, yet the air was crowded with presence. Vincente knelt, not the stiff, mechanical kneel of the possessed thing that had worn his body for 66 years. A real kneel, old bones cracking, real tears. Sancte Pater, he whispered, and this time the title was not mockery. Luca looked at him for a long moment. You're free, he said. Vincente nodded. The silence broke the chain. I felt it go. I am myself again, for the first time since 1958. He reached into his cassock and withdrew a small wooden box, olive wood, worn smooth by centuries of handling, inside, wrapped in linen yellowed to the color of old teeth, lay a second ring, not bronze, not gold, iron, rusted, pitted, the size of a fisherman's thumb, on its inner curve, barely visible, the faint outline of a fish. Luca knew it instantly. The original, the one Peter wore when he walked on water and sank, the one he wore when he drew the sword in Gethsemane, the one he wore when he warmed his hands at the charcoal fire and lied 3 times. Vincente placed it on the altar steps between them. The entity is ready to speak with you, he said, not through me, not through the ring on your finger, directly, one fisherman to another. The chapel lights dimmed of their own accord. The frescoes faded until only outlines remained, charcoal sketches on plaster. And in the center of the void, where the Last Judgment had been, a figure appeared, not dramatic, not terrifying, just tired. A man in his 60s, Galilean, sun-browned, barefoot, wearing a simple tunic stained with fish scales and salt. His beard was gray, his hands calloused, his eyes the color of deep water after a storm. He carried no halo, no wounds that bled, only the weight of 2,000 years of unshed tears. He sat on the altar steps beside the iron ring, legs dangling like a tired workman at the end of a long day. Shimon bar Yonah, Luca whispered. Peter looked up and smiled, the saddest smile in history. In the flesh, he said, voice rough, accented, the voice of a man who had spent his life shouting over wind and waves, or what's left of it. He lifted the iron ring and turned it over in his fingers. I denied him 3 times, he said, conversational, as though remarking on the weather. Everyone knows the story. What they don't know is what happened after. When he rose, he forgave me, feed my sheep, he said, but forgiveness is not the same as release. The denial stayed, like a fishhook in the heart. Every time I spoke his name afterward, I felt it twist. He left me here, not as punishment, as penance, to guard the keys until someone was willing to take the hook from my heart and swallow it themselves. He held up the iron ring. This is the hook. Every 1,000 years it finds a fisherman, not a demon, not an angel, just a man willing to say the words I could not unsay. If he says them with the full authority of the keys, the hook passes, I am released. The silence ends, the light goes out. If he refuses, I wait another 1,000 years. Peter looked at Luca with eyes that had watched empires rise and fall. You are the first in 2 millennia who almost strong enough to refuse. Almost. He placed the iron ring on the step beside the bronze one. 2 rings now, one of guilt, one of office. Choose, Peter said gently. If you put on my ring, you become the new prison. The denial lives in you forever. The Vatican stands. The world continues. I finally die. If you refuse, I remain. But the third denial will be spoken anyway, by the next one or the one after. Eventually, someone will say yes, and when a true pope says it, the consequences are not hellfire. They are silence, perfect, eternal silence, the kind that existed before let there be light. No pain, no torment, just nothing. Forever. He stood. The chapel around them had vanished. They stood on a night shore, waves lapping at their feet, the charcoal fire crackling between them. Peter picked up a stick and poked the coals, just like that night. I am tired, Luca, he said, not angry, not vengeful, tired. 2,000 years of carrying those 3 words. I do not know him. They weigh more than the cross. He looked at Luca, and for the first time there was something like hope in his eyes. Will you take them from me? Luca looked at the iron ring. He thought of the child in Fallujah with the flowers. He thought of the frost handprint. He thought of the silence that had almost swallowed the world an hour ago. He reached out. His fingers closed around the iron ring. It was cold as deep water. Peter's face lit with something that might have been gratitude. Luca opened his mouth for a moment. The third denial hovered on his tongue, perfect, ancient, ready. Then he closed his fist around the ring and pressed it, not to his own finger, to Peter's. The iron slid home as though it had never left. Peter gasped. The fisherman's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it looked like pain. The charcoal fire flared once, bright as magnesium, then died to embers. Peter looked at Luca one last time. Thank you, he whispered, and dissolved, not into light, into silence, the kind he had carried for 2,000 years. The chapel reappeared around Luca. He was alone. The bronze ring on his finger, the ring of the fisherman, the one of office, was warm, content, quiet. The iron ring was gone. Peter was gone. On the altar, a single fish scale lay gleaming, iridescent, impossible. Luca picked it up. It weighed nothing and everything. He walked out of the Sistine Chapel into the corridor where the Swiss guards still knelt. They rose as one when they saw him, not in terror now, in awe. He passed them without speaking, down the stairs, through the bronze doors, into the piazza where the obelisk stood clean of blood and the sky was the color of a new morning. The cock in the gardens was dead, feathers scattered like snow, at the center of the piazza. Luca stopped. He looked down at his hand. The bronze ring pulsed once, gentle, almost affectionate, and in the silence that followed, not the killing silence, but the ordinary, human kind. He heard it, a whisper, not from the ring, from inside his own chest, where the frost handprint had been. A fisherman's voice, soft, grateful, already fading. There have always been 266 popes, and one who was never counted. Good night, my son. Pray you are not next. The ring tightened, just slightly, a promise or a warning. Luca closed his fist around it and walked on, into the Roman dawn, the weight of 2,000 years of forgiveness settling gently on his shoulders. Behind him, in the empty Sistine Chapel, the fresco of the creation of Adam glowed with new light. God's finger reached toward Adam's. The spark leapt, and for the first time in 2,000 years, it held, but in the deepest chamber beneath the Vatican, where no map has ever shone, something stirred, a new iron ring, freshly forged, waited in the dark, patient, eternal, counting heartbeats, waiting for the next fisherman. Good night. Pray you are not next.